Hi everyone. Today's lesson in greenhouse environment is hopefully interesting. At face value, it looks like just plants and temperature. Actually, this should actually say light as well, because we're going to talk about how the two are interplayed. Um, just to help with set the stage for the analogy here, the idea is that, and again, you'll know all this, right? So light drives photosynthesis, and photosynthesis makes sugar, and sugar is fuel. Plants do stuff with sugar, just like we drive to school or wherever in this COVID thing, when we're not stuck at home shopping on Amazon. Anyways, sorry, I digress. Anyways, temperature. So light drives fuel, and temperature controls the rate that we burn that fuel. So when it's a warmer temperature, the plant grows faster. When it's a cool temperature, the plant grows slower. Again, this should be pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised at how often people get confused about this. So especially about the fuel part. Okay, so let's go through this lesson and hopefully make sense by the time we get to the end of it. So there's the analogy, a car, the idea of fuel in the tank, and you stand on the gas pedal when you want it to go faster. So temperatures are throttle, and light levels are our fuel supply. So the more temperature we give to the plant, the faster it will develop. The more we step on the gas, the faster the car drives. The more light we give the plant, the warmer, the faster we grow our crops, right? The more fuel we have in the car, the longer, the faster we can drive. So the idea is that if we give the crop more temperature, it will grow faster and consume more fuel, but we have to give it more light to give it that extra fuel so that we can take advantage of that. And this curve here kind of explains the growth response. Now they're using a term, leaves unfolded per day, using standard crops, often tobacco or Arabidopsis. They will subject a plant to light intensities and different temperatures, and they'll count how many times a leaf unfolds. Usually a leaf unfolding means it has unfurled at a 45-degree angle from the stem, and then it's considered unfolded. So the faster the plant's growing, the quicker it's developing leaves, the quicker those leaves are unfolding. Now, obviously, this is fractions of a day, so zero point 0.1 leaf in a day. It's not like you're going to get a leaf every day. That'd be bonkers. Maybe duckweed, but yeah. Anyways, so as we go from 10 degrees up to 25 degrees, you can see that there is a linear response that the plant is growing faster. This is a fairly typical response. And as we get warmer, things start to die off. In fact, they go down. Do they actually go negatively? No, not necessarily, but they certainly growth stops. It might actually go down to zero in terms of the sense that no more leaves are unfolding, I guess. But okay, so there is an optimal point at which the plant is not growing at its optimal speed anymore. So it's just like a car. Eventually, you reach a limit where it's optimal. You can't go any faster. The key here is to go from here up to here means we need to be making sure there's enough fuel, which is why we need enough light. So say, for example, in the dead of winter, just cranking the heat up alone isn't going to do it because there's not enough sunlight during the day to supply fuel to take advantage of all that money you're paying to heat the greenhouse. So you have to think about the crop you're growing and can you take advantage of it? Maybe you should put grow lights in. So as long as there is enough fuel, right? If we don't have enough light, we can't make enough sugars, we can't take advantage of a warmer crop situation. So if you're pushing the gas pedal, make sure you got enough light on your crop so that there's enough fuel that you can actually take advantage of that temperature. Otherwise, you're running your boilers for no reason and your business will suffer. So one more time here, right? So light equals fuel and temperature equals speed. So you can go slow and steady, or you can go really fast. And if you remember from one of my other lessons, I mentioned that you're better off to have lower light levels for a longer period of time than really intense light levels for a short period of time. So let's say we turn this into micromoles, right? Micromoles of light. If you had the choice, say both these situations have the same amount of light, you'd be better off with the lower light level for a longer period of time because your plants will have a better chance of moving those sugars around instead of them being all formed in the leaf and locked in there. Now, if you increase the light for a longer period of time, then you get even more yield. Maybe not 24 hours, not all crops like that, right? But, you know, definitely by adding, and this is where we start using supplemental grow lights. So if you're looking at getting more light, then you also need temperatures. And in the winter, if you're running 20 degrees Celsius in your greenhouse and it's a really cloudy day, it may not be useful for your plants because they'll have consumed the sugars, the little sugars that were produced. So then you need to run grow lights. That's my kid sneezing, sorry. Again, this is Liebig's law. We mentioned this in Plant Science 2, Liebig's law of the minimum. This is the idea where plant growth is controlled, not by the sum of all growth factors, but rather it is limited by the most limiting factor. And in the case of Plant Science 2, we talked about things like nutrient deficiencies. But if you look carefully, over here it says there's heat and light and CO2 we'll talk about later. But so heat and light are also, in a sense, inputs that go into your crop to achieve its maximum growth potential. So you need to make sure you balance the correct heat and light levels. So as far as this sort of philosophy of Liebig's law, I just want to stress one more time, right? You can't alter plant growth in the sense that you can't make it do something it's not genetically programmed to do. Right? So plant growth is not enhanced, rather it is limited. So the less we limit our plants, the fewer mistakes we make, the closer we will be to the maximum potential genetically that plant can achieve. It might be confusing why I'm talking about that, but I think I'm talking about that because many times people will try to sell you a miracle ingredient or something like that that will boost your crop. Now, what I'm trying to say is you can't boost a crop. All you can do is meet its requirements. Excess of something that is a requirement does not mean enhanced growth, right? The only way we can prevent limited growth is by not making mistakes in any of those ingredients in Liebig's law of the minimum. So when people are trying to sell you stuff that's got to make bigger buds or whatever, a lot of times they're just trying to make money and they're not necessarily speaking truth. As far as temperature goes, you can keep boosting the temperature, but there is something happening in the background, and that is respiration. You and I are doing it right now. We're breathing, right? We're breathing in oxygen and consuming it. And plants do the same thing. Respiration happens all the time in a plant, and photosynthesis only happens when there's light. So let's look at the bottom here. We've got 5 degrees up to 50 degrees, which is obviously very hot. Notice the graph of respiration increases as temperature goes up, right? And it peaks right around the 45 degrees Celsius. And then things die. And of course, when they die, respiration stops. When you and I die, we stop respiring as well. So that's respiration. Let's look at photosynthesis. Under low light, so let's say wintertime, plants from 5 degrees up start to produce, and then they sort of max out, and they're not making any more sugars, and eventually it gets too hot, and even photosynthesis stops working, and then they stop, and it's dead, or nothing's happening. It's a static day. And then if you have high light, it jumps all the way up to here. This is in terms of dry matter. This is the amount of material that's grown in a day or whatever fixed time you've used. Now, so here's the question. At some point, consumption of carbohydrates by respiration, right? Remember, respiration is consuming carbohydrates, will exceed the amount of carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis. And that is right here where they intersect. So at this point, when you are at this temperature, let's say, I don't know what that is, 40 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, photosynthesis is meeting or matching the requirements of respiration. So there's no sugars left for growth. It's stabilized. So at which point do you think the plant will achieve its maximum growth rate? So let's look at respiration. Let's see where it drops down to its lowest. And let's look at photosynthesis. Let's assume highlight levels. Peaks right around here. So we want respiration to be minimum, photosynthesis to be maximum. Boom, right? So at this point, photosynthesis is producing lots of sugars so the plant can lay down new cellulose, build proteins, whatever it needs to grow, and respiration is kept at a minimum. So it's not robbing the plant of too much sugars in that process. You're going to get maximum growth at that point. So in Canada, light is often a limiting factor. We are fairly far from the equator. So especially in the winter months, we need to supplement, right? So we need to adjust that. If we can't add light, we need to adjust our growth factors, which means basically reduce temperature. So again, if we want higher temperatures, we can't do them without light. Cannot compensate for light, lack of light. So in a sense, if you have no supplemental lighting in your greenhouse, you might as well float the temperature lower. Monitor your growth rates. Every crop is a little different, but there's no point in paying for all that energy to run warm temperatures if you don't have enough light. Now, most greenhouse computers will automatically float the temperature set point according to the sunlight levels. So typically, if it's a blue sunny day in January, the greenhouse can get quite warm. So the computer will let the temperature in the greenhouse float up, maybe 20, 25 degrees Celsius before it starts venting. So the plants can take full advantage of that sunlight that's happening. And the second the sun goes behind a cloud or clouds roll in, the temperature in the greenhouse will start to drop as the computer lets it float down to maybe 10, 12, 15 degrees Celsius, depending on the crop, to save on energy, because there's no point in putting heat into the crop if it can't take advantage of the sunlight. Crops do grow differently under different temperature and light regimen. And this is sort of a crude depiction of a leaf. This is a cross section, so we're taking a cross section of a leaf and looking at the cells. This is just sort of an iconic way of looking at it. So under highlight with low temperatures, we get thick cell walls. So these are depicted as thick, and slightly more cells. We're going to say higher numbers of cells. Now, if you have high light and high temperature, we have exactly the same thing, but we have even more cells. There's two layers. So in the real world, what that means is that under high light and high temperature, plant leaves are a little thicker, a little healthier, a little lusher. Under low light and low temperature, cell structure is weak. We have thin cell walls and there's fewer cells. So we have 4 cells here, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells at the top. I mean, this is just an analogy, right? And then, of course, if we have low light and high temperature, we're really stressing the plant out. So the cell walls are super thin, and there's very few cells for a given leaf structure. So that means that in low light, high temperatures, leaves are very thin and very weak, which usually invites insects because the plant will evaporate volatiles through that thin cell wall, and insects will smell that and be attracted to the plant and attack it, especially knowing that the cell walls are so thin they're easy to attack. So typically poorly grown crops are much more susceptible to insect damage. So yeah, high light, high temperature, thick, robust cells. Low light, high temperature, thin, weak cells. Now remember, the cell walls are thin because cell walls are made of cellulose, which is made of sugar. And your plant is struggling to make enough sugar to exist at low light, high temperature, because respiration, right, high temperature, respiration is robbing the plant of a lot of its sugar. So there's very little left to grow cell walls. As far as the lowest temperature certain crops can handle, it's all over the map. Something like what we're doing at the college, cucumbers, their lowest temperature is 12. That's pretty warm. Tomatoes 9 to 12, peppers similar, and then you go down here to the ornamentals. But in our crops, lettuce is a cool crop, 4 degrees C or less. That's the base temperature. It's not necessarily the happiest temperature, but it certainly doesn't mind it being on the cool side, which is why lettuce is often, a spring crop fairly early. Also, if you were to plot the base temperature to the total days to flower, right? So this is an annuals thing. Looking at petunias, which are an interesting crop because they can handle high temperatures, their crop time shortens dramatically as you get warmer. So the plant's growing faster and faster and faster. You're going anywhere from, say, 130 days down to 50 days to finish. But that's pretty warm, 28 degrees. It's doable. Not in the danger zone of 30, 35 degrees Celsius. Just an example of a crop. A lot of breeders would have this information for different species for bedding plants. So excessively cold temperature, right? So if we go too cold, sometimes you get eco-friendly greenhouses that are trying hard to minimize their carbon footprint and they want to grow really cold, maybe no heat at all, just sort of have thermal banks. There's usually a cost to this. If you can't maintain a minimum temperature, things like flowering is delayed, like the previous slide showed. You end up with reduced root activity, and when your roots are not functioning properly, you get nutrient deficiencies, specifically phosphorus. That's the first one. That's why plants look purple in the spring, because phosphorus is much more difficult to take into the roots when the soil is cold. Obviously, at some temperature, plant stops growing. That's definitely bad. Chilling injury, if it gets even colder, you get tissue damage. Now, if water freezes inside a plant tissue, what happens is the water forms crystals. Those crystals grow bigger and bigger, and they actually are like javelins, and they puncture the cell and poke holes in it. And that's often, you don't notice the damage until the tissue thaws. And when those ice crystals thaw, all of a sudden the holes that they poked become gaping holes, and everything leaks out, and the entire thing deflates like a big bag because the crystals poke through all the cells and microscopically puncturing them all. And eventually you get, even if it never thaws, you still get desiccation, freeze drying kind of, and the plant just doesn't do well. I mean, these are pretty extreme temperatures. I mean, even the cheapest person's not going to let their thing get that cold, their greenhouse, but it happens accidentally if you don't have an alarm. This is just some examples of what can happen to mature geraniums. They've got a purplish tinge, so we're going to call that what deficiency? We're going to call it phosphorus. And then this is for seedlings. This is horrible. Young seedlings, you get uneven germination. You get a lot of rot, pythium, attacking the seedlings as they emerge. So trying to keep your propagation bench too cold ain't going to work out too well for you. And then as far as temperature goes, I've just spent a little bit here talking about how we measure temperature. Typically, there's a sensor hanging over the crop. This is just your typical sort of climate sensor. Often one per zone, and it's somewhere above, but not too far from the canopy, right? And that's the temperature of what? The air in the greenhouse. The trouble is, we're measuring air, but what we're talking about today is plant temperature. And the two don't always jive, so a lot of the computer programs have to sort of extrapolate, but that's difficult to do. What we really want is leaf temperature. There are actually companies now selling sensors that you deploy in the greenhouse that point an infrared sensor at a leaf and measure its actual surface temperature and report that to the computer. That's still fairly experimental, but a lot of greenhouses are experimenting with that stuff. But I suspect that eventually that will become more mainstream. But leaf temperature is difficult to measure, so we need to sort of extrapolate. So if the air temperature is, say, 25 degrees Celsius, what temperature is the leaf? But that is not straightforward because there's all sorts of other climatic factors that that impact that, like humidity, airflow, shading. So um, this is a complicated picture. I don't want to get into all the nitty gritties of this, but in a sense, these are different greenhouse configurations. This is a top venting greenhouse with side vents, so the air can come in the side and escape out the vent and out the top. Fairly common. Um, these are different scenarios in the sense this one here is the same as the one above, except it has misting nozzles which shoot water out, fog. And then this one, which ironically is the coolest, number 4, right, has an external shade system that is over top the greenhouse and the same venting as the others underneath the shade. Now, interestingly, this is not suitable in a climate like Canada where we have snow, but external shade is very common in tropical countries. So the only downside to having external shade in a tropical country is you have to be careful for damage with high winds. So if you live in a typhoon area or hurricane coastal area, not necessarily a good idea. So this is combining misting inside and an external shade. And that is the coolest of all these scenarios for the leaf. Now, misting, we know, helps cool the leaf directly, right? So in this situation here, the misting is under the bench off to the side, and that helps cool the ambient air, but doesn't actually cool the leaf. Now, sometimes you have to do that because having water right on the leaves is not always a good scenario as well. But for all intents and purposes, we'll talk about the misting as obviously a way to cool the leaves directly, not just the air. Talking briefly about the root zone temperature, we've been talking a lot about above the root zone. If you have a warm canopy, that's the leaves and stem above the soil level, versus a cold roots, that means that your roots will be less active than your foliage, right? Which means if the soil's too cold, it's going to reduce water and nutrient supply to the plant. So it could become limiting. But at the end of the day, as this slide points out, this is a normal occurrence in nature. More often than not, the soil temperature is a little cooler than the air. So I think up to a certain point, this is totally acceptable. If you flip this, warm roots in a cold canopy, we end up with an issue of increased water and nutrient supply. Now that at first might seem like not a bad thing because we've talked about having warmth underneath the benches, especially in propagation zones. But if you warm the root zone too much and you get too much root pressure, it can actually put water pressure up the plant that will cause stems to swell and burst, or buds to swell and burst, or fruit to swell and burst, like tomatoes bursting. So we have to be careful that the roots are not so much out of whack with the air temperature for the canopy. It is definitely not a natural occurrence unless your plant lives above a volcanic subsoil, but whatever. Anyways, it's not normal. So what are things that influence plant temperature? We'll talk first about heat loss. So we're losing heat. This might be a little bit of a strange concept. Radiation. Think about it like this. You go for a jog, your face gets hot, and when it gets hot, it radiates heat. That's part of your body getting rid of that excess heat. And leaves do this as well. They actually radiate the heat off their surface. They can also conduct. So we have radiation heat loss, and they can also conduct. So let's say you've got a fan blowing air over your crop, and that air will take the heat away from the leaf, conduct the heat off the surface, and blow it away. So moving air can also influence the leaf temperature by conducting the heat away. The other thing, which maybe is a little more abstract, is evaporative cooling. Right? So the idea is, and this is a really important one, so please wrap your head around this. We know that from plant science, when plants have stomata, which means they're breathing in gases in and out, they're also evaporating moisture out from the center of the leaf to the atmosphere. And that evaporation process actually cools the leaf. So almost all the time, as long as a plant, has enough water that it's transpiring, the leaf will be cooler because of evaporative heat loss. This is really important. Makes a big difference in terms of how crops work. I think I mentioned in one of the labs how it can be a 35 degrees Celsius day outside a greenhouse in the summer, and if you're in a big tomato greenhouse, it's maybe 25 in the rows because the plants are doing so much evaporation that they cool the greenhouse. Okay, how do we gain heat? So we gain heat from radiation in the other direction. In this case, the radiation was leaving the leaf. In this case, the radiation is arriving and impacting the leaf. So sunlight hits the leaf and warms it, just like you go outside on a sunny day, boom, you feel the heat on your face. That's radiation from the sun. That's radiative heat gain. The other way would be similar to heat loss. You'll see how these sort of juxtapose each other. There's conductive heat gain from the air. So in this case, think of it as opposed to the top here. Let's think of it as wintertime, and your leaf is cold. You heat the air, and then you blow the warm air over the plant, and that warm air conducts heat onto the leaf as it passes by. So conduction works in both directions, as does radiation. But notice evaporation, not so much. The only thing that can happen in addition to these is some soil temperature can conduct to the roots. You know, can connect up to the plant, but that's kind of neither here nor there. Maybe a little bit of bottom heat, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. Here's a picture kind of depicting what I was talking about. We have sunlight impacting the leaf, so that's radiative heat gain. And then the plant can also radiate the heat away. So long radiation or long or far red radiative heat coming off the leaf. And by the way, you can see this happen with infrared cameras in real time. And then, of course, there's evaporative cooling, right? So we have, that's what we call, down here, water is leaving the leaves, and that evaporation takes heat with it, so that cools the leaf. And then there's conduction and convection. Just like in a greenhouse, the earlier slides, we talked about how greenhouses gain temperature. So the idea that air flowing over the leaf will warm it or cool it. Same thing with convection. Basically, any kind of air current moving over the leaf will take heat away or gain it. I put this picture in here just to sort of remind some of you how evaporative cooling works. It looks like the droplets are probably big enough to get them wet, but generally speaking, if you have really fine droplets, as they go from liquid to gas, the temperature drops. And so you end up with moist air, but it's cooler. So maybe up here it's 30, and inside this bubble it's 22, let's say. The point is that the energy that it takes to turn those water droplets into water vapor absorbs heat from the air. So the air, as you move away from this, gets progressively cooler, and the people down here benefit from that. If you've been to Wonderland and stood in the cooling station over by those trampoline wires, then you'll know what it's like to have evaporative cooling. It's quite nice. Actually, they have radiative heaters as well, not far from there, for people to warm up after they come off the whitewater rafting. I really missed Wonderland this summer. I'm just going to say that, I love the rides. Anyways, so evaporative cooling, active leaves, so I mean that's alive, sort of goes without saying, they transpire. So as long as their stomata are open, this is an important thing to keep in mind. As long as the stomata are open, the plants can transpire. Makes sense, right? Well, think about it. Two things that could stop stomata from opening. Potassium deficiency, like severe one, which means the cells start to die in the leaves. You get necrosis. Or not enough water. So if your plant wilts, it doesn't have enough water to open the stomata, let alone transpire. On top of that, you need to make sure that the air around the leaf is dry enough, right? If the air is not dry, Oh, I'm getting better at writing with my mouse. If the air is not dry enough, you're not going to get evaporation, you're not going to get cooling. So this is one challenge we run into in Ontario when in the summer we have fairly high humidity. So sometimes plants really struggle to cool their leaves down. And what might seem like an okay day to you, 32 degrees Celsius, 95% humidity, it's a muggy day. Well, for what's a muggy day for you is actually really uncomfortable for the plant because that doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room for evaporation. So two things happen. The plant can't cool from evaporative cooling because the humidity is so high outside the leaves. Second, if the humidity is high, the plant can't transpire. If it can't transpire, it can't move nutrients from the roots up and it can't move sugars around the plant. It's like having a heart attack. So it's a brutal time. Hot, humid weather is really tough on plants. They have to be specially adapted to it. Eventually, evaporative cooling, the idea is that the energy from the water is transferred to the leaf, and that means the leaf loses energy as the water evaporates. I don't want to get too stuck on that right now. Try to talk to me if you have trouble understanding evaporative cooling, because it is a concept that you definitely need to learn. But the idea, just like the previous slide, as water evaporates, it pulls energy from its environment. So if you go to the bathroom and you wet your arm, even if you use warm water, eventually your arm will feel cool because as the water dries off your arm, the act of the water going from liquid water in your arm to vapor in the air sucks heat from your arm, the surface. So as water evaporates from a leaf, it also sucks energy or heat from the leaf. Hopefully that makes sense. Uh, I want to leave you with this last thought. This is about too much light. Um, we started off by talking about light producing fuel, and the fuel is what drives growth. And we spent a lot of time talking about temperature and how temperature controls the rate of growth. And also optimal temperature, optimal light levels. And if you end up with too much light, you can actually burn crops because at the end of the day, light is like hitting a leaf is producing electrons like a solar panel. And those electrons, if they're not absorbed quickly, they cause damage. This is an interesting leaf here. You'll see one part of the leaf is burnt, the other's not. What likely happened here is this leaf was shaded for a long time behind something, and someone moved the plant into an area where it suddenly got more sunlight. And this part of the leaf was not acclimated to the high light levels, and so it burned. We call this solarization. These are localized solarization spots, too much light. This is fruit that's been scalded by the sun, too much light. You get the picture. There is such a thing as too much light. You can burn your crop. Every species of plant is different. Typically plants with dark green, really photosynthetic leaves, they struggle with too much light. Take for example spinach. Spinach is a spring crop. It's adapted to cool, low light conditions. You throw that in high light conditions, it doesn't do very well. And if you've grown spinach, you'll know it doesn't grow well in the summer. It's more of a spring crop. There are some varieties that are adapted. So anyways, photosynthesis, electrons zipping around, and if there's too many electrons, the chlorophyll can't cope with them, and those electrons actually cause what we call oxidative damage, and it's random and it's usually bad. Some plants are adapted to high light levels, and they produce antioxidants in their leaves, like carotenoids, and they help absorb those free electrons, like a sunscreen. So some of those plants are better suited to high light levels. And obviously antioxidants are something we look at from a nutritional perspective because they're also how protect us from oxidative damage in our own bodies. All right. Well, I hope that makes some sense. I hope you remember the analogy of fuel and a throttle in a car. And the fuel in your tank is the amount of sugars, and the throttle is the speed. And if you want to drive faster and longer, you got to make sure you got enough fuel. So you need more light. So, all right. Take care.